Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today I am talking to Andrew Rader Hansen, a poet and a candidate for his JD, which officially means that he is a law school completer, a law school respecter, as opposed to me, a deviant law school pre dropout. Like I got accepted and then immediately dropped out. Um, so and we're talking about something that I think people are going to find surprising because we are talking about this in a political context. But we were talking about well, about said early modern, but it was actually early medieval poetry, particularly Anglo-Saxon and say chivalric French poetry. But mostly we're going to focus on Anglo-Saxon because while I've read some, French stuff, I went through my stupid I have to learn everything about all the Arthuriana period in high school and then had to teach it for a little while back in the day. I am really more interested in the early medieval period because it's always interesting to fall in love with the period where we have material culture, fragments of poems, and like religious texts, but really we don't know shit. So, because no one was keeping records between like the 5th and the 8th century in a lot of these areas, and particularly in the area that we're talking about, which is Anglo-Saxon Britain. Um, and recently we've even had to modify our view of Anglo-Saxon Britain based on genetic evidence, that like they didn't go and massacre all the Celts after all. They just intermarried them and uh, erase their language somehow.
Yeah. So for the 5th century, and so we have the Adventus Saxonis, right? The advent of the Anglo-Saxons to Roman Britain,
Mhm.
and we have a single written source for this, and that single written source is Gildas, who is a British monk, and his account. He is not trying to write history here in a sense. He is trying to write moral invective. So he's trying to show how the Britons sinned, and was the reason for the advent of the Anglo-Saxons to England, and their subsequent pushing the British out um, of Eastern Britain, England. So I mean, it's kind of hard to talk about like do we call it Britain? Do we call it England? But yeah, none of this really exists in a sense. England is not a coherent entity probably until like the 10th century that it becomes a unified thing. You
Well, I'd
know.
say generally we can really start talking about England with Alfred the Great, and that's even kind of questionable. Uh, you know, there are a bunch of kingdoms, and there are a bunch of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. There's also the Danelaw. There's the Romano-British leftovers in Wales, and parts of the East Country. Um, the the king is a fairly weak position when you compare it to all of prior imperial rule. And it's interesting because we don't. So, one of the things we've learned from before we get into the poetry, I just want to give people a lot of historical context. But one of the things we've learned from uh, archaeology and from genetic studies on in England is there was a massive population drop in the British Isles. But what we don't have evidence for was a strong quality of life drop as far as conditions um, from the bone evidence that we have in that time period. So you have a loss of technology and you have a loss of population. We don't know really what caused the loss of population either. We don't know if it was lots of people, migrating back to Roman areas once Roman rule weakened. If it was, we don't have a lot of evidence of stuff like plague. There were obviously border wars and stuff this entire time period, but we don't have evidence of a massive war. We don't have evidence of an extermination. And we also have this loss of knowledge of technology that I always like to talk about with people like, people with a Whiggish view of history. I'm like, no, they forgot how to make saws. They had them. Like the Anglo-Saxons and the Celtic peoples of the British Isles at this time had saws, but they didn't make any new ones. They were all left over from the Roman period, and they went back to manufacturing axes. Now, I would normally find this ridiculous, except that I also know about a similar phenomenon in Egypt after the Roman influence started to decline there, and there was a decline of the ability to make pillars to hold up buildings. So when you see mosques and churches built in like the 9th century of Egypt, you see them with stolen pillars from Greco-Roman and Egyptian pagan sites, or they had to be replaced because they were made out of wood. And so we had a similar loss of technology. So we have this is, we saw this kind of pattern all over the Roman world. But what we don't see is a decline of literacy. There's lots of text from this time period. We're going to go into that. I mean, there's tons of poetry from this time period, actually.
Yeah.
We don't see massive signs of like I said, like obvious nutritional deficits or anything like that. We do see a major decline in infrastructure, but there's a lot of evidence that they didn't need the infrastructure either. So it is interestingly this time period of collapse. Now, how did I get interested in this? One, I think the Dark Ages is a patronizing way to talk about this time, but it is dark in the sense that we don't have a lot of historical evidence that isn't material culture and or fragments of literary stuff that's saved later, and most of it's non-contemporary. We have to rely a whole lot on poem fragments and one manuscript of Beowulf and stuff that's copied later by people like Bede for a lot of what we're going to talk about today. In the British context, we don't really know how the Romano-British and the Germanic tribes that came in integrated. We know that the Germanic tribes set themselves up as as a kind of ruling caste, the way the Normans did over the Germanic tribes later. But it seems like there's lots of intermarriage.
Exactly. And actually, a good example of this is that in Beowulf, Hrothgar's wife is Wealhtheow. And Wealhtheow, the word Wealhtheow means Welsh slave, which is very interesting. But more than that, which kind of may suggest that some of these Anglo-Saxon kings were marrying Welsh people, and it also suggests some kind of subjection, of course. However, and at the same time, when the Adventists, so Gildas actually suggests that Vortigern, who is this British leader at this time, invites these mercenaries over to help deal with some of the northern tribes like the Picts and the Scoti, I think. And this is also a pretty good possibility because we know that the Romano-British were reliant on the Romans to send up legions to help them deal with their northern neighbors who often were pillaging. And so there's a possibility that there may have been Anglo-Saxons or Anglo-Saxon Jutes, these tribes from Denmark, from Scandinavia, there serving in a mercenary capacity, and perhaps, as with lots of cases throughout the medieval period, the mercenaries end up realizing that they're the ones holding things together and decide, okay, we're just going to become the ruling class now and take over. But yeah, so there are lots of Germanic place names during this period, but also, like, for example, in Northumbria, lots of these place names just remain British, and we're not or Welsh, we're not entirely sure why. Um, but also, for example, with the word slave in the Anglo-Saxon period for a long time, it also means Welsh. So it's a very complicated thing, but it does seem like
Similar to how Slav is actually slave as well, even though like it's also an ethnic group. So it's just like the group most likely to be enslaved. But clearly, a queen would not be a slave. So even there, it's like a reminder of a past status, but it's not an actual status in the poem. Um,
exactly,
and
exactly.
Vertigern's an interesting to get into more nerdy sub territory here. Vertigern's interesting to me because we don't know if that's a name or a title because it like literally translates from like a kind of Germanized Romano-British Welsh, patois to Great King. So it's like
Yeah, yeah.
we don't know if it's a person or a title.
Exactly. Yeah. No, absolutely no guarantee that that someone like Vertigern even existed, for example. Um, so yeah, it's a pretty interesting period in that sense.
I mean, he is mentioned in Bede and Gildas and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and becomes like a literary character in Geoffrey of Monmouth,
Yep.
which is where your Arthuriana really gets going, which is why we have to bring it up. But
Yeah, yeah, and they're all copying each other also. So it can be interesting. And also, yeah, Arthur is an interesting figure as well because he really takes on a huge he he's they really blow him up in a sense in the later period. Like, I feel like Arthur isn't really a thing in the Anglo-Saxon period, but it's not until like maybe the 12th century that, for example, Geoffrey of Monmouth is taking this figure and turning him into something much bigger than he may have actually been. And yeah, we don't even know if he existed. So
yeah,
yeah,
right now, I mean, the figure of Arthur as we have post Monmouth definitely did not exist, although there may have been an Ambrosius that may be the actual historical model. But there too, we don't have a whole lot of evidence. Um, and it is interesting where that whole legend comes from because it's very much rooted in kind of French Brittany, which means there is a kind of ethnic Gallic connection to the Celtic peoples of the Romano-British period, or what we might call the Proto-Welsh.
yep, yep. Well, a lot of them had fled, I think, to this part of Brittany, in France today. So, and there was always this link between the Welsh then and Brittany. So in
Yeah,
France.
so that's a big part of where this we see a lot of evidence here. Now, one of the things that me as a Marxist I like to talk about is like class relations in this time period are actually kind of difficult to conceive of in the ways that we would in a modern sense. Like there is a proletariat in the kind of strict literal sense of the Latin sense of that word, which there's plenty of propertyless people. Um, they are what we would now call a mixture of serfs and free peasantry who don't really have. They might have communal property. They don't really have any title to anything. But there's also the formal law codes have broken down to the degree until Bede really happens. They start trying to like do the Doomsday Book and really record who has title to anything. Property is kind of hard to understand and prove during this time period because the law is malleable. um And I'm sure there's medieval historians, because there are a lot of there are medieval historians in my audience who are going to point out. Hopefully, you do point out where we know more specific things. But it seems like most of the things I know are from the 9th century forward. We don't know much at all about the 5th to 9th century in Britain. But that does bring us to the poetry, and one of the things that I want to talk to people about today, and we're going to talk about like why I think studying historical poetry is important. It's similar to why I think studying historical religion is important, and this is the nerd part of this show. Is that for a lot of these periods of breakdown, and the big one is after the fall of the Roman Empire, but it's not just that. Like we could talk about this in like the warring states period in China, or this, that, and the other, that our primary literary evidence comes from two things. And that is later recorded poetry that looks to have enough anachronistic phrasing or other things to tell us a little bit with a lot of historical context and deconstruction. And we'll get into that when we talk about Beowulf, because oh my God.
Yeah. The poetry is very interesting, because there's a way in which poetry is not very useful to historians, but it's also very useful to historians in the sense that it is giving us like the sense of what was happening. And yeah, it's very, like, I've heard a lot of people describe poetry as almost like pure ideology, in the sense that it's distilling like feelings, it's distilling a lot of different understandings that, for example, the chronicles are, if you're reading a chronicle, it's often like, on this day in 700, you know, Bede died, for example. Like, you don't really get too much out of that. You can't really analyze that too much to a certain degree. But for example, like, you can look at the Battle of Brunanburg, which is a very interesting poem. And what's interesting also is that we do not have good archaeological evidence for where Brunanburg happened. So we don't know where Brunanburg happened, but we have what is a very sensible understanding of perhaps what happened, and a praise poem for these two royal figures, and lots of different literary tropes being used to extol Edward, for example. So it can teach us a lot about the time period and what forms the poet is deploying in order to achieve their goal, for example. But you're not going to get like a date, for example, and what's reconstructed through the poem should not be trusted as, to be confirmed in archaeology, for example, because something like Battle of Brunanburg, we don't have archaeological evidence for, even though we know that it happened. So it's an interesting period. So
yeah, this is something that I think people like struggle with, because on one hand, when it comes to a lot of this stuff, we have to remind ourselves that unless it's something that's going to leave a lot of material culture behind, like a city or a massacre, um, you're not going to have necessarily a lot of archaeological evidence for it. This is a problem that we have when we deal with like indigenous people in the Americas, about how much should we trust or not trust their oral traditions. And the spectrum of this goes back and forth greatly. But that's one of the things I like to point out. That's not unique to indigenous people in the Americas. Like, we don't know this for Europe too. Even some place like Rome or England, which are places that are historic by historical standards of other cultures, very well over documented, because of their various imperial importance. We don't know a lot about, and we have similar problems when we try to like reconstruct, say, the early Mongol Empire. We got lots of material evidence of things happening. We also have records that indicate things, but how much can we trust those records? We don't know. One of the things I've learned to trust is I actually think we can often trust the poetry a little bit more than we can trust the chronicles, because the chronicles tend to be explicitly regime justifying documents.
Yeah.
I mean, what you can trust the most is usually business transactions, frankly, because even back then, merchants will lie to others, but they don't lie to themselves generally.
Yeah,
But
some of the charters are important documents, you know.
but but for experience of what people thought, particularly if you're interested in anybody other than like merchants and the ruling classes who are writing the chronicles, usually the only thing you got is material detritus, if you can find a trash pile, and poetry,
Yep.
and it's usually not the poetry that you think. I mean, like the epic poetry is going to tell you a lot, often by what you have to reconstruct from it, and we'll get to that when we talk about Beowulf. But things that we do have more evidence of, such as like uh, poems that are like saved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, are stuff from the Exeter manuscript and stuff like that, where
Yeah, I would say like the riddles, for example, which are often focusing on like everyday things, like onions, for example, like and farming, the plow, these kinds of things. Like this is, I think that this is incredible. It's an incredible survival, you know, because there's certainly no reason for them to record some of this stuff, for the monasteries necessarily to record it, or the ruling classes to want it recorded, for example. But we do have the riddles, which are often focusing on like laborers. I mean, there are examples of poems about slaves, which is very uncommon. We don't have very much on slaves. Although there is a slave in Beowulf, which is another very interesting thing. So
yeah,
yeah,
epic literature is usually a literature of a ruling class, or a class subordinate to a ruling class. So, for example, we talk about Homer, that becomes a poetry of a ruling class. But and that's a whole. I am fascinated by ancient Greek studies. I will totally admit that that's another weird. All these are weird hobbies that I've developed over the years. But you read, first time you read the Odyssey in high school, you just think it's a cool monster story. Then you realize how weird the narrative is constructed. Like it's got layers and layers of frame. It's got multiple frame narratives.
yep,
Like there's a frame narrative, and there's a frame narrative within the frame narrative, and then it's not told in chronological order at all. And you kind of have to construct that and figure out what's being said there. The character is very odd, and then you have stuff like the difference in the characterization, and not just the characterization of, say, an individual person. Like Odysseus is very different in the Iliad than he is in the Odyssey. Um, but also like the difference in the way people are characterized in general. But there's a difference between the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's part of the whole, like, we kind of know that the Homeric hymns are composite because of that, and we figure out a lot from that. I recently, I hope people listen to this interview. It will be out by, I think it's out now. I think it's released the day I'm recording this, where I talked to a scholar, Dr. Miles, who works in Australia, on class struggle in the Old Testament, and through the a kind of likely historical personages with Jesus. But what's interesting is like Dr. Miles actually doesn't comment that much at all on what we actually can reconstruct from Jesus himself. He comments on what we can reconstruct about class movements from this religious history, a lot of which is frankly literary, and we don't think of it as literary because we think of it as a religious text. But that distinction of secular and religious texts is really a post Enlightenment one, and
absolutely.
kind of uniquely European too.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. That's another thing, is that looking back into this period, like
mm,
it's a good question. Like, what can we actually know about this? Because it feels like Enlightenment is almost like this wall that we have to try to scale, in a sense, to understand like pre-Enlightenment thinking and stuff like this. Um,
so let's talk about some of the poems. Like, you mentioned the Onion poem, and you sent it to me. Now, I could
Yeah,
do
let's
my
look at it. Hold on.
I could do my really, really bastardized trying to still pronounce Anglo-Saxon through the lens of my bastardization of Low German. But people who hear me mispronounce modern German definitely don't want to hear me mispronounce an ancient form of it. But so we'll read it in English. But I do think people should approach it in with the translation, unlike Middle English, which I think you can figure out without training if you try. Um, if you have a lexicon of some French words that we dropped, um, you really can't approach Old English without studying at least early German.
Yeah, it takes probably, if you know German, for example, it'll be pretty quick to learn Old English, but usually it takes a couple of months, I would say, to really learn it. And the poetry is definitely more difficult to read than the prose. But yeah, so about this poem that we're about to look at, it's a riddle, and it actually kind of focuses on one of the characters in it is a woman, and that's another point to talk about, is the role of women in this period, and I guess in heroic culture as well. Just before we get into the poem. And another thing that's stunning about this poem is that this doesn't seem to be an elite or noble woman in our poem here. But women in this period are often, when it comes to the elite, for example, they're considered these peace weavers, and so often the elites were marrying off their daughters, their sisters, in order to secure alliances. Um, that's a good example. But also, for example, in Beowulf, um, Wealhtheow, which is Hrothgar's wife, is really enacting this peace weaving role by ensuring that Beowulf is um, is treating Hrothgar's sons well, because we know with dynastic struggles and stuff, Beowulf might first go after his rivals. And so the role of women in this period, it shouldn't be like, there definitely is like a form of misogyny in this period. Like, women are considered are not considered like men are considered. At the same time, like, they're performing extremely important social functions. Um,
and it's important to note also that a lower class woman can marry an upper class man. The reverse is almost not ever. We don't have any evidence, like a lot of evidence that the reverse happened at all. But so, and it shows up in that and Wealhtheow again, because her name indicates she had a slave status, and that she's not a Dane at all, or a Geat.
it's very interesting. Yep.
And what's interesting about Beowulf, indeed, is while it's an English epic, it's actually not even set in England at all, although there's hints of its relationship to England throughout the poem, which is fun. But let's get into this Exeter riddle. This is from Exeter Riddle book, which is where we have a lot of this really interesting what we would consider maybe, common life. I hate to say, I don't want to indicate that it's necessarily low class, because you'd still have to be somebody involved in this is literate, and literacy is pretty rare in this time period. But it does record slices of common life, because they're probably things like when we talk about the Odyssey and the Iliad. I was about to talk about that as well. These are things recorded from things that are said out loud. These are people recording things that the first instance of them is probably significantly before they're written down, and may not even be from the class of the people who are writing them down. And that's really important for our ability to reconstruct any of these notions. So let's get into this, because you can learn a lot from this kind of old Exeter poem. I'm going to read the Megan Covell translation that you provided me, because I don't really want to butcher the Anglo-Saxon. For those of you who are listening, I'm going to refer to Old English as Anglo-Saxon because I don't think you can really say anything Middle English forwards effectively a different language, in my opinion. Like there's
it's pretty different.
It's radically different. Like yeah, I mean we still have most of the remnants of Low German, our proto Low German in our language, hence why if like an old English speaker was hanging out with a modern Frisian, they would probably be perfectly comprehensible to each other. But it's still, and if you're a modern German speaker, you can probably figure it out, but you're not going to know it from listening to it. And we don't really know how it was spoken. Unlike with Shakespeare, since there's less rhyme, there's a lot less ability to use metric indicators involving rhyme to figure out what the likely OP is. And even with Shakespeare, the only reason we do that is that there's so much commentary on when something is a slant rhyme or not that we know that that X sonnet wasn't considered slant rhyme when it was actually said, and therefore we know that we can kind of retroject. Okay, well this rhymed 100, 200, well not 100, 200, 500, 600 years ago. But in the case of Old English, we don't have any of that, and
there's not much rhyming in Old English. The structure of the poetry is very different than, for example, the later period, like Shakespeare, for example. You have a lot of heavy alliteration, these kinds of double lines that are kind of cleaved in between.
There's Juras and whatnot everywhere. And there's doubling everywhere. And if you used to like ancient Hebrew poetry, it's similar, but rhyme is just not really a part of it.
I think that maybe there's like one poem that rhymes in the whole corpus,
Yeah. And that makes sense. There's a lot of other, like, people think of rhyme, they think of late medieval, Middle English, they think of French, they think of the Romance languages, which they rhyme because they fucking rhyme anyway. Just, if you ever spoken those languages, they're very rhymey. It's not that impressive. And if you read, it's interesting to kind of find parallels to this. I'm like, the immediate parallels that come to my head are like, well, if you read Hebrew or I don't know, Chinese poetry, even though that works radically differently because it has both a syllabic and an ideogrammic structure. But this is more syllabic. It's more based on pauses. It's more based on alliteration. It's more based on meter. And rhythm is really important, but it is not based on rhyme, and it is not really based on meters that we're more familiar with from the Greco-Romance traditions. Anyway, so for those of you who just listen to the really nerdy part, let's go on. I am a wondrous creature, a joy to women, a help to natures. I harm none of the city dwellers, except my killer. My base is steep and high. I stand in a bed, shaggy somewhere beneath. Sometimes ventures the very beautiful daughter of a churl, a maid proud in mind, so that she grabs hold of me, rubs me to redress, ravages my head, forces me into a fastness. Immediately she feels my meeting, the one who confines me, the curly locked woman. Wet will be that eye. So this is like a triple entendre, which I love.
Yeah. It's a very suggestive poem to say. So yeah, there's a lot going on here, but
these are all this Riddle tradition, right? So people who know this, our main form that we have of the two Anglo-Saxon literary forms that aren't boring ass prose, and Anglo-Saxon prose is boring. I'm just gonna like
Yeah,
it's
a lot of the prose can be boring. Some of the sermons can mimic the poetry, so
yeah
some of the
yeah
sermons are a bit different. But I do know what you mean. Some of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is pretty boring. So,
yeah.
but
I
yeah,
mean yeah,
go ahead.
and the Doomsday Book is boring as fuck. So,
Oh my god, yeah, yeah,
um, but
yeah,
anyway, but from this manuscript, so this is obviously really suggestive, and I think to the modern reader, the obvious answer to this joke is penis.
yeah.
Um,
But also onion. So that's
yeah,
another
but
suggested
it's an
answer.
onion, and this the double answer seems to be important. In fact, it seems to be uh, that the solution of this is actually onion, but it wants you to think it's dirty most of the time. Other answers to the riddle have been proposed. I think leek is proposed, and also all your really like your long stalked root vegetables that were common in England. Um, Mustard is another one.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. But what's also interesting is that, like we were saying, that this is portraying labor, which is something that the elite are not necessarily doing. But also, it's a woman, right, doing this labor. And for example, I think that lots of us assume that in Christian society that the woman is supposed to be inside of the home or whatever. This is actually like a more Protestant Reformation thing. But back in the day, on the farm, for example, I think that especially in the medieval period, that everyone is working. Um,
yeah, I
and
mean,
there's probably a material necessity for it, because if your harvest gets messed up or whatever, then there's a good chance you might die, and you might have to sell yourself into slavery, right?
well,
But
here's the
yeah,
thing. I don't want to pretend like in this period there are no markets. That we have evidence that there are markets, but like it's a much less marketized society than even the period right before it, which means the distinction between public and private work pretty much doesn't exist, except that you're often working for a lord. Um, well, in this time period, even that's a little questionable. You might be working for what we might call a proto lord, our chieftain, our
yeah, I
our
think that
earl. So
yeah. So I think that lots of times some of these peasants, freemen, whatever you want to call them, they have some sort of obligations, food obligations. Um, so and it could be an obligation to one lord. It could be an obligation possibly to two lords. There is also obligations to the monasteries nearby. So some of this could get really oppressive. And actually, there's an example of, for example, Canute in one of his laws, kind of cutting back on some of these obligations precisely because they were considered very oppressive. And so,
yeah,
yes.
and
Um,
Canute, for people who don't know, comes from the Danelaw, even though he becomes the king of England. I guess he's in
yeah,
the
Canute is an interesting figure. I haven't studied Canute as much as I have like the 600s to 1000s, but yeah, he ruled over like multiple Scandinavian kingdoms and also ended up in control of England. So, but yeah, so with this poem, another interesting thing is that this is pre Reformation, or sorry, pre Protestant Reformation, and
it's
I
very pretty Protestant Reformation,
yeah,
like
exactly,
like
exactly,
a
like
thousand years almost. Well,
me in the sense that, for example, like the dirty, for example, is not considered, is not stigmatized like it is post Reformation. And I think that people assume that in anything in Christian culture, anything in Christian society has to be like anti-sex, for example. But you have lots of sexualization in the Anglo-Saxon poetry, and this is a really good example of it. Um, so
Yeah, well, they're pretty far from Rome. Let me put it that way. Like,
Exactly. Exactly. And actually, another thing that would be interesting to talk about is why the papacy survives. And I think part of the reason why it survives, rather than the Roman Empire, is that it doesn't have to have hire soldiers, for example. Um, it doesn't have to enforce, like, it's almost like a soft power and is much easier to maintain um, than an empire with incredible amounts of troops, for example.
yeah, most of the church does not have a standing army. I mean, it's not all of it. I mean, like there are areas. Although at this time period, again, so hard to say. What particularly, and we have to remind ourselves, this is not just pre-Reformation. This is likely pre-Great Schism, at least the second one. And the first Great Schism doesn't affect the Europe at all. So people who don't know your Christian history, which lo and behold, the Jubu explain Christian history to you, but that's what I'm going to have to do today.
Classic.
Is that um, the Monophysite schism, which is what kicks the Ethiopian and the Armenian and the Egyptian church out of the Chaldean church, uh, or the Chaldean church, which would become what we consider the Catholic Orthodox Church hyphen still together, um, is early on. Plus, unified Christianity. Who fuck knows how actual unified it really was? I mean, we know there
It
was.
was not. I mean, lots of these monasteries, for example, like they're running for perhaps like decades without oversight, potentially from a bishop, for example, might visit more frequently, but higher officials from Rome, there's not really, they're not coming over to check in on monasteries, and there is quite a bit of what might be considered to the church corruption and a lot of sin, so to speak. And there are big movements towards Reformation in England because you have monks, for example, drinking a lot and singing poetry. And a good example of this is Alcuin, who sends a letter to England, to one of these monasteries, and says, "What does Ingeld have to do with Christ?" Basically, telling these people, stop singing about these pagan heroes. Ingeld is this pagan or heroic figure, and so it's a persistent problem. Lots of these lots of the monks are getting married, and stuff like this. So
Yeah, I mean, well, the prohibition against priests getting married, I don't even think exists yet. For part of this period, I'm going to knock on wood for that because I can't remember what century it is that they have formalized priestly celibacy. I think it's like the seventh, um, and it's only in the West. One of the things that we also need to remind ourselves, while the papacy is an important institution, it's by no means clear during all this time period, even in the West, that it's the dominant episcopal institution, because the papacy is considered first among equals with the other apostolic seats, which is going to include Antioch, it's going to include uh, Eastern Rome or Constantinople, it's going to include Egypt, etc. Now, Egypt gets sawed off in the first Great Schism, and we also have to remind ourselves the Arians are still existing. So, like, even the idea that the first Great Schism is the first break the Christian unity implies that there's a Christian unity in the first place, which there wasn't.
yeah,
So
yeah. Another good example is, like, for example, like Kievan Rus is looking towards Constantinople, and the Viking connection to Kievan Rus means that to Kievan Rus, and also like they visited Constantinople a bit and wanted to trade with them, like means that the Scandinavians would have been in contact with the Constantinople and Eastern Orthodox potentially before they might be in contact with um, with the Western Rome, right?
Right. But yeah, this is actually interesting. It comes up when you meet British Eastern Orthodox believers and priests when they talk about the Anglo-Saxon Catholic and Celtic Catholic.
Yeah,
England
the
is
Celtic
as
Church is another example of a
yeah,
rival in a sense.
being probably more like the Orthodox Church. Uh, Although politically that's complicated because the Orthodox Church is so tied to the Byzantine Emperor, and in the West, by the time you get to not even before you get to the Carolingians, like that's already not a viable project. There's not a political attachment to the emperor, which is kind of where the beginning of that, and the language difference that the Eastern Church is so concentrated in Greek.
Exactly, that's a big part of it. Yeah,
But you're right. Like the Varangian Guard, for example, as well as the Kievan Rus, both had extensive relations with the Byzantines, and we also know from slightly later, like the 9th century, the Anglo-Saxons had extensive trade routes through these Scandinavian rulers. That we have coins, and I'm bringing this up all the time, but it's important. We have coins in places like Mercia with Arabic on them.
Yes,
Because they're trading with they're trading as far out for stuff aimed at basically the caliphate, which is filling in for parts of who they used to trade with in the Byzantine Empire. And these are like long established routes. And we know the Varangians are around. We don't it's interesting you brought up the Kievan Rus. I mean, basically, we know a little bit about this because, for example, Olga of Kiev is a thing, and that is probably the first, one of the people who Christianized the Kievan Rus. Who, for those of you who don't know, Kievan Rus are from they're from the Rick line of Scandinavian Vikings. Yep. Now this gets into all your weird Nazi stuff that exists today about the difference between the Kievan Rus and the Muscovite Rus and the Asiatic.
Man, I don't even want to think about that stuff.
But... Yeah, it's tied into this actually weirdly, but racialized in a way that no one in this time period would have done it because they didn't think of the terms.
Yeah, another thing about this whole period is people project race on it all the time, and like there's no sense. There's so much. It's so much more heterogeneous in a sense than people want it to make it out. People want it to make it out to be. Like for example, like Kent, and this is pretty early on in Anglo-Saxon period. Kent has close connections to the Merovingians, and very early on, Kent is marrying off to the Merovingians, and the elites, for example, like in a sense, there's a closer connection between elites than there is between the elites and the underclasses, for example. And the
they didn't think of themselves as the same people, and that's actually clear in some of the epic documents. Like they're the way they talk about people in the same society. Like this idea of a coherent nation is a modern idea. Like the elites in this society would have seen themselves, like the nobility are at least within a language family, would have seen themselves as being more related than not. And that includes the Normans, because even though we associate the Normans with French because they are, the Normans speak their own dialect of Frankish Latin, which becomes French, or we might call Old French. That which is a Germanicized Latin in the first place, because the Franks are a German tribe. But the way that we encounter it, so that we think of them, the Normans, as clearly French, but they're actually also a different group of Viking invaders who'd also taken over Sicily, and
Well,
like
yeah. Some part of them took over Sicily. A good amount of the Normans participated in the Crusades. I mean,
right.
but I mean, we have to be careful also. Like how many Normans were there? You know what
We
I
don't
mean?
know.
Like
I mean,
we
like
don't know. Like it
it,
could have been a small amount of these warrior elites.
I mean,
But
that's
like
similar to like the Arab conquest, for example. I'm going to use that because I know a lot about it. But like, we always assume, oh, the Arabs came in and they slaughtered everybody, and we don't have the Egyptians, and that's why the Egyptians aren't black or whatever. Which is like, North Africa has always been weird in that color. Like we know this from genetic tests on ancient mummies that their skin tone ranged from me to extremely dark, in the same area. And it's weird when skin tone demarcators come up in the ancient world. They do come up. It's not like they're never mentioned, but they're usually mentioned in periods of breakdown, and they're not really like coherent races. They're like for
yeah,
example, if you're reading Nonus from like the 5th century, this time period, but on the Latin side down in the south, um, he's describing black people, but he's not describing them as Africans. He's actually describing scary Indians that are coming in, and he sees as invading, and that the Dionysus cult's going to fight. But then the same guy, and this is something to think about this time period. This same guy also writes Christian poetry, and we don't know if it's like post conversion. We don't know. We have no idea. Um, but this is when it's mentioned a lot. During the Greek periods of warring states, people start mentioning race more in terms of color. But what's interesting is the color there is not what you think it is, because white people are Greeks, but yellow people are Germans. And you realize, oh well, in one case they're referring to the hair, in the other case they're referring to skin tone, and then Ethiopians are their own thing, and that may or may not be what we think of as black Africans, but it may be also like dark Levantines. It's not. We don't have that. We also talk about like early church fathers. We have no idea what race a lot of these people were by our standards. Like, is Augustine of Hippo black, white, Arab, Levantine, Greek? Well, he's culturally Roman, but do we know his race? Absolutely not. We don't. Like
yeah,
it wasn't even considered that important to record. Um,
yeah. And what's recorded also, like there's much more division also between religion, for example, rather than something like race.
yeah,
So, but also, yeah, the Anglo-Saxons and, for example, the Noel Codex, which is the Beowulf manuscript, is a very interesting manuscript because it has the wonders of the East, and the wonders of the East are these representations of these monsters that are they um, they're these representations of these monsters scattered throughout the world, and so there's this sense in which there is a much better sense of wonder to the outside world than would be, for example, today when we can look up anything on Google, for example. Well, obviously, but travel is like is not happening like it's happening, and especially with the pilgrimage is not happening at this period like it's happening later, and so everything is very local to a certain degree. I mean, there is like globalization does exist, but it's much slower, and
right.
and
It's
along the
trade
sea route.
networks of merchants along a sea route who don't really know each other, and like what you hear from random, usually Vikings, talking to other random, usually Vikings, who until they get to the Greek speaking part of the Roman Empire, aka what we now call Byzantium, you don't really have a whole lot. But we know a lot that these people encounter each other, because we also know it from like the Arab side.
Yeah,
We have we have recordings of who the Varangian Guard was from like Arab observers to the court, and that's late in this time period we're talking about, from 500 to 1000. But we have it, and we have actually probably more of that than we do a lot of other citations, because, well, the Arabs brought a lot of shit down.
Yeah, the Varangian Guard also is defending against. I think it's the Third Crusade. So the Varangian Guard is around for quite a while for the Byzantines. But also, yeah, go ahead.
No, we can. You and I are both nerding on the history because clearly we both love this period of history.
I know. It's great.
But one of the things that I like to think about, class is really important here, and I think people need to understand that elites travel these. There are like raider warrior class people who travel, but the vast majority of people are not traveling around.
Yep.
And it's because it's fucking dangerous. And like,
roads, the infrastructure is is not like it was, right?
Right. Well, I mean, you
can't
have
preserve. It's hard to preserve food for a long time. That's another thing. So.
Right. Well, this is the thing. Like, hospitality rules are important in this time period, and they're important in certain cultures still today. But one of the reasons they're important is like, you can't really keep food for more than 3 or 4 days of, you're going to have to find fresh forms of food. And yes, it's possible for an army or a caravan to provision themselves, because you have a scale there that makes it possible, although they might starve the peasants along the way. The individual traveler can probably have about 2 days of, cheese keeps for a little while, but not in the heat, not that long. And a smoked meat will keep, and you got a few days of wine or mead, or beer. Water goes stagnant pretty quick though. And so, you got a couple days between needing to reprovision. You have the Roman roads. They were built really well. Some of them still exist, but they're like, if they're not finished, or if there's something have broken them up, you don't really have that. You have sea routes, but one of people wonder like why people didn't get that far out. And again, just think about food preservation. That alone makes it difficult. Like, imagine carrying enough beer, or whatever alcohol, but in this time period, it's probably going to be beer, or wine, to maintain people on a ship that's going to be manned by galley slaves, to sail for very long periods of time. And like some of these epic journeys, it's possible to do, but the food limitation alone is, I don't think modern people even think about it. I didn't think about it until I really started digging in this history and thinking about why there were such limits, why there had to be raids. Like, if you're a traveler, you're relying on raiding or hospitality. If you're an individual traveler, you can pretty safely rely on hospitality if no one kills you on the road.
Yep.
Because you're also, when you're not known to people around you, who's going to vouch for you, particularly if you don't speak the language and you're not an elite who can come in with a guard.
There are accounts of like important bishops, like just getting
off,
killed, like literally, and the chroniclers, for example, are like, well, this isn't a martyrdom, this is, it's travel and movement is a very important and I guess overlooked thing.
But let's talk about the Noel context, because what's in that codex is wild from a literary standpoint.
Yes.
That's where we have the full copy in our unique complete copy of Beowulf, and we're going to get into how weird Beowulf is, because Beowulf has fascinated me for how weird that poem is. Weird in that, like, you definitely see a lot of transition. You also have the letter of Alexander to Aristotle, which is a forgery, but it's interesting that it's in there. You have a poetic translation of Judith, which is, which is a retelling of the book of Judith from the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. So for those of you who have your deuterocanonical books, but it's not even like a translation. It's a retelling in like an Anglo-Saxon form. You
Yep.
have the life of Saint Christopher.
Oh
You
yeah.
have you have, but it's pretty incomplete. And you have not the most complete text of the Wonders of the East, but one of the most complete texts. And there's two codexes, and it um it's been damaged. Like it survived a fire in a library. But also like it kind of feels what's in it's kind of random. It's just like, okay,
It
this is
does. Yeah, it does. And I think that there's a compelling case that it might be something like a monster manuscript. It's very secular. There's a lot
although
of
there's a lot of saints histories in it. I
no,
mentioned
you're right.
too. There's also like a partial translation of the Gospel of Nicodemus, and
Yeah,
part
no,
of
it's
the life
very
of Saint
interesting.
Quentin. Um, and I think also there is, what is it? It is an supposedly Alfred the Great's translation of Augustine's soliloquies.
Is that I?
That's in the first codex. We've been mostly talking about the second codex, which is where Beowulf is from. But the first codex, I think, is
Oh,
more
gotcha. Yeah,
damaged.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Um, so
It's
it's
partly damaged. Yeah, and it's crazy that we have it. Like that's another thing. Do you know about the whole the dissolution of the monasteries and stuff?
yeah, to some degree. I mean, like in the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation, mainly seems like a property grab for the king, really. Uh, because like for example, the Anglican and Episcopal orders still kind of have a monastic tradition, sorta. Or they at least have religious orders that go back to the monastic tradition, but the monasteries are pillaged, and a whole lot of stuff is lost.
Exactly.
Um,
The dissolution of the monasteries is almost like a traumatic thing for medievalists because precisely like the monasteries are just like are getting dissolved, and a lot of these manuscripts and stuff are basically just some of them are getting thrown away, and so you have a figure like Lawrence Noel, this like 16th century, almost like an antiquarian type, who is going around collecting these kinds of things, and they put these kinds of things in the Ashburnham House, which is just a hilarious name to keep all of these manuscripts and to have Ashburnham House burned down.
yeah, that's funny. I mean, people who want to learn about this kind of stuff in this time period, the Geniza of the library, the Geniza of the I've literally been to this synagogue. It's a synagogue that dates back to, I think it's been Moses, um, to probably the 8th or 9th century in Coptic Cairo. So in the Christian part of Cairo today, it wouldn't have been it would have been the Christian part of Proto Cairo then. Um, one of the things that one of the reasons why we know so much about the Fatimids and all this is anything that had the name God written on it couldn't be burnt. And so in the Geniza, which is this great document trash pile, basically, and that Jewish community just stored all these documents because you can't burn the name of God even, and that includes, by the way, since they were speaking Arabic, or Judeo-Arabic more than they even were like Aramaic. That includes Muslim texts too. So the reason why we know a whole lot about 19th century Egypt is because of a trash pile. And so the texts that we have are random, other than the fact that they have God in them somewhere, right? Similarly, I think the Noah manuscript, like random antiquarian codex, random Old English text, and they store them in a shitty place.
Yeah. Yeah. Well. So part of it, there might be a case that part of it is more related to. I mean, you know what? There's so many books written arguing that they were related. They were meant to be, a secular a secular gift to a warlord of Mercia, for example, in like the 8th century. That but yeah, it also looks like someone like Lawrence is running around sewing these things together randomly and just sewing them together and taking it for himself.
Well,
Um,
I mean, it makes sense though because books are expensive. These are handwritten manuscripts, and if you got a couple of them and you want to maintain them, I don't know, throw them in one book, like throw them in one codex. We can do that, like, um, which is which makes the whole. The more you learn about the limits of physical technologies, about why things are what they are and their length, like why are the Bible books they're particularly well? That's because how big you can make a scroll,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
and
and yeah, when it comes to like, yeah, another really important aspect of Anglo-Saxon like literary production is the manuscript, and in the early medieval period, all the way up until the printing press, the way that people are producing manuscripts, is by slaughtering animals.
it's Valium, right? Yeah, we're not using papyrus or paper.
Exactly.
We're using we're using actually a byproduct of meat productions, which makes it
Yeah.
which a Valium, which is usually what lambskin, which also it's a shit ton of lambs.
Lambs. I mean, lambs, goats. I mean, it depends on which animal you're using. Like, if you're depending on the animal, your manuscript is going to look a lot better or not.
Mm.
For example, but something like manuscript production, because you have to kill animals, you have to take time skinning it, you have to dry it, you have to put it together with leather. It's a huge, huge process, Herculean. And so, who is going to control manuscript production? It's not going to be it's not going to be the peasants. It's not going to be the freemen. It's going to be usually landed elites who have the kind of money to support something like this. The church, which has the money to support this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so the context for lots of literary production is mostly church and elite.
Well, it's very expensive. Just the labor time alone, you're gonna have you're gonna have to literate monk, which is specialized skill. Some of the monks actually probably weren't literate; they're just good at copying. That's another thing we've learned. That's what when we kind of figure that out from like weird illuminations that don't seem to have anything to do with what's actually being. Um, so you have and it's an art form, but also it's Valium is expensive. You have animal skin paper. Um, I don't know how we lost paper. Um, uh, the East has paper. Egypt has paper. I think the Arab world has paper, but like Europe doesn't have paper. Um,
Yeah, I hear that they also were using like wax tablets, to
right.
practice and stuff like that. But
Well,
obviously, wax tablet,
well,
it's
this is another thing that we like. For example, when we talk about like the ancient Celts, um, they wrote on rocks and on things seemingly related to wood or leaves. Well, that ladder ain't gonna last very long. Like, so
yeah,
so there might have been actually a fairly thriving literary culture. We do have some attestation to something like it, at least among the Druids. Who knows what the fuck they were up to? Because no one really does, except for Roman slander. But and Christian reconstructions post facto. I mean, we have this problem with Viking religion, like because most of our sources for that are actually Icelandic and also post Christian. But although we do have a lot of authentic fragments and like Futhark and whatnot to kind of reconstruct stuff with, and we have a lot of material evidence, and we have
yeah.
Roman
The
description.
runes, the runes are
Yeah,
pretty important.
yeah, and
Um,
we have Tacitus and stuff like that. Although Tacitus was writing from rumors.
yeah, it was.
The
Although some of it is quite
Some of it ends up
is
being accurate. So I
yeah.
mean, that's the thing about throwing out oral
And it's in the
culture.
first century, which is just insane. And so, I mean, for example, he talks about the warrior culture. He talks about how that it's disgraceful for the companions, talking about the Thanes, not to equal their chief in battle, and it's a reproach and infamy during the whole succeeding life for a Thane to retreat from the field. And this, it comes from the first century, but it's a very accurate description of the warband. And this warband, the way that it would work, it would last for like 1,000 years to, maybe like the 12th or the 13th century, in which you have a king and his retainers, and the king and the retainer are tightened by bonds of loyalty, and the thanes are expected to give their life in battle at a moment's notice for the king, and the king is often distributing rings, distributing gold, and so this is almost like a kind of economic unit, in a sense.
Yeah. Honor.
Yeah.
Well, this is something I have trouble.
It's a lot of honor, yeah.
This is actually even true in the early United States. So when people think, "Oh, this is so far removed," no, early United States has similar things. So, for example, why is your name honor so important? Well, before we have standard currency, and I want people to remember that we didn't really have standard currency till after the Civil War. Your local currency may only be taken a couple of cities away if you didn't have like a state currency or whatever, or a banknote or an IOU. And IOUs were super important when you did not have standard currency, and you didn't, as I said, you did in cities, but you often didn't outside of them. And so if your name was slandered and you lost honor, your coin was not as good. Like you literally had trouble spending money or making IOU trades and banknote trades because you probably didn't have a lot of legal tender.
Honor culture is a very important thing, and it comes up all over like pre-industrial society. I feel like
one of the things that I we talked about this when I was talking about Tolkien to you, and like how I kind of like am a Tolkien nerd, but I also like do push back on some of the conceptions he pushes through, because like he does not seem to completely, even though he's a medievalist, like fully grok how much this honor stuff is also economic. Like this, and I don't say this to be like a vulgar economic determinist, because I don't think it's that simple. But this honor stuff is not just that, but it's tied into that in a very real way. Exactly. So
very important. Yeah.
And we know, that we also see this is not unique to Scandinavian German peoples. We know, like, we have a similar system that we know from the Iliad with the Attic Greeks and the Mycenaeans. We know, for example, that honor and trade and value and rings and all these things are all tied together. Now these rings are weird. Like I always thought they were like Roman wedding rings, and I realized no, they're like these weird neckband things.
Yeah, some are torques. They're called torques. There are these. I'm forgetting their names, but sometimes they have these things where they clip their cloaks together. These are
these brooches.
Brooch. A brooch is very important.
And you got to remember also, people didn't have a lot of clothes. Like again, we rely on the labor of others too. People should not forget that. But we've mechanized a whole lot of that labor, or at least greatly reduced the amount of physical input it takes to go into it. Yay, it's one of the few good things about capitalism. But when you look at like the ancient world, particularly in time periods, it's not to say people were totally pre-technological. They weren't, but like in time periods of breakdown, like they have beautiful artisan craft stuff, and we have all kinds of material evidence for this. But also, like, you're gonna have, if you're fairly well off, unless you stole it in a raid, you don't have a lot of that, because it's gonna take a long time for someone to make it, and you're gonna want to really keep it up. And so, like, you're not gonna have a lot of clothing. Clothing's gonna be fairly simple. You're gonna have, like, it's one of these things, for example, even again, to think about pre-fast clothing, there's a whole lot of like things that we don't do anymore that we associate with formalities, such as like overcoats and stuff like that. But then when you think about like, oh, I have a suit, I have, if I'm a worker, I'm gonna have one suit, right? And I'm gonna have one work suit, and I'm gonna have underclothes, and that's where my t-shirt's gonna be, and I might have 3 or 4 of those, so I can change those out, and maybe 1 or 2 hats and a couple ties, and that's if I'm doing well. Like now, and I'm gonna really work to maintain those clothes. We're not gonna wash them all the time, so I'm gonna wear layers more. Not only because it's more practical, because I have to also protect this fucking investment. So like, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of stuff in this time period that we know from material culture, like sleeves that you just cut off and put back on because like you only have like 2 tunics and you don't want to waste it.
Yeah.
And then then there's also sumptuary laws because people want to be able to tell class by just looking at you. So there's limits on who can wear what, and it's not just like, oh, well, only the king can wear purple. Like it's very specific, which is also where a lot of weird, what we would now consider weird religious rules about what people wear come from, because it's tied into sumptuary laws into marking who belongs, who's in what class, and what you are. Like, because it needs to be visually recognizable to people very quickly. And we also know this, to bring it back to the topic of this, because a lot of this seems very tangential to poetry, but we know a lot of this because of tying hints in the poetry, particularly these riddles that we were talking about earlier, and then like aligning that with these epic poems, which tell us much more about elite culture, aligning that to these religious texts, and then looking at that material evidence that we have, and now in the last like 40 years, tying in genetic evidence too. We can construct a whole lot of this, but it's a lot of like, triangulation and speculating off of what you can tie together in this time period in particular. But it's a good way to think about a lot of other time periods that are closer to you, because in some ways we tend to over rely on non-literary literary texts. So what I mean by that, like business reports or newspapers or official documents, etc. We tend to trust them, and for some good reason. And the closer you get to, the more you get to mass literacy, the more there you have multiple attestations, you can verify stuff. But when we're dealing with like anything before the 13th century, we're like, well, we got an epic poem, and we got like a bunch of prose novels for rich people, and we have maybe a letter that somebody read out loud to the local peasants that somehow survived in a trash heap somewhere.
You, as a medievalist, you cannot simply focus on like one medium. You have to be looking at multiple different things, looking at archaeology, looking at the handwriting, the manuscripts, like all these different things, because there are just so few sources, So medievalists are really having to work with what they have, but also not limit themselves to one area. For example, literature. You want to incorporate other forms of evidence and such, and post with capitalism and stuff, and the way that the university ends up being broken off into the different subjects, we lose some of that, because we're focusing on literature, we're focusing on archaeology, when in reality, to get like the real picture of what was going on, you have to be looking at a bunch of different fields at the same time, to get a holistic picture of what is going on.
Yeah, and the structure. For those of you who are listening, there's an Lester McIntyre essay that I read out loud that comments about the problematic fracturing of the academic world into its subdepartments relating capitalist division of labor that actually makes this really hard to fucking understand, because paleontology and history, etc., are technically separate departments in the university. And while there's always talk of interdisciplinarity and breaking down the barriers,
hard to do,
it's very hard to actually do. And
and most people are just motivated to go get a job, so it's like they want to hyper focus on something, and they don't want to be dabbling in other things because they're honing a skill or something, so they go off to do a job, you know.
But let's talk about, because we're talking about, you know, having to rely on material culture. But this, what's funny about this is even in the literary evidence we have contemporaneously. So this is from the Exeter book, where we have a whole lot of these poems and riddles that are not epic. And this is there's this elegy, which we don't have a lot of elegies from the Anglo-Saxon period, but we do have a couple. And it's the ruin. And
the ruin is very interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to read an English translation, I think that you sent me by Dr. Aaron Hostetter. But and we can talk a little bit about it. And for those who want to keep up, I'm going to put these links in the show notes so you can go read them. And if you're, and where we can, I'm also going to put it where you can read them in the original Old English if you want to try to figure that out. And if you're not a specialist and don't read German, good luck. But although, yeah, you can learn in a few months if you know German. I have read Beowulf in the original with little help. But
it's doable.
It is doable. And it actually, once you do that, as a side note, as an English educator, a whole lot of weird shit about why English doesn't have consistent rules starts to make sense, because you start seeing, like, almost in our language and archaeology of where the English
Norman conquest is visible in the English language, as it exists. It's very interesting.
As our religious transformations, as our, like, bishop controversies. I mean, like, as is the Reformation, et cetera, but there's a whole lot that you can learn just from, like, why is that so fucking weird in English? Oh, it's where French meets Anglo-Saxon and you made a compromise. And why is English so flexible grammatically? I have my theory that Middle English is a pidgin language originally, which is not, I will also say, is not a conventional theory. I don't think in its first dissertations it was commonly spoken in the home. But that people were either speaking French or Anglo-Saxon, and that was like a street patois between the two. But that it quickly becomes a Creole. And then modern English is really from that, and standardized post-Reformation, when the national projects really start and you have the printing press. And we know that because, like, if you look at even Middle English spellings, you're like, there's no way these people, like, if you were from a village, like, just, I don't know, 30 miles away, you might say stuff completely differently. And even in modern English dialects in England, if you find people who still speak, like, I don't know, I'm going to pick something because it's in the news recently because PJ Harvey wrote an album in it, like Dorset or Yorkshire or something, or something like that. It's a dramatically different English. Like,
a good example is the Thames. It's spelled Thames. You would think that it would be Thames, but it's the Thames. I actually don't know the etymology behind it, but it's an example,
Yeah, there's tons of these regionalisms, and in England itself, which, they're actually probably more apparent. But just imagine that before there's a standard printing, and you quickly get, like, oh, you could probably go one county to another in these counties. These counties are also kind of remnants of formal kingdoms. Let's also remind ourselves of that. But, like, and you will understand kind of what is going on, but it might be like, if you've ever went drinking with a Scotsman, and had them switch back into Scotch in front of you, which is, kind of comprehensible to English, and by that I mean Scotch, not Scotch Gaelic, Scotch, which we can have the great debate on whether or not it's a dialect or our language, but it's pretty not comprehensible. But just imagine that everything is like that a couple counties over. And
it's much more intense.
Yeah, in the U.S., to tie this again into our literary culture, part of our whole mission was like the knower speller to make sure that we were standardized from moment one. We wanted to be distinguished from the fucking British, and more power to them. You stupid. But two, and more importantly, we had strong regional dialects, but there was a big push even in the beginning to standardize them. In this time period, going back this far, there is not. There's not even a way to really figure out how you do it. Like okay, the King's English, you're going to fix, you're going to do official King's English pronunciation. Have you heard the King ever? Really? Do you even know? Probably not. And in this time period also, you might not be speaking the same dialect, although it's also interesting how mutually comprehensible some of these things were. So like Old Norse and Old English are different languages. But if you tried, you could probably figure each other out. Yeah,
absolutely.
I don't speak or read any Old Norse, not pretending that I do, but I've been reading on the history of German actually partly to prepare for this podcast. And people do think that like, the Danelaw and Old Norse and English were still somewhat mutually comprehensible at this time period in particular. And it also it affected both ways, and that shows up in Beowulf. But let's get to the ruins, because this is interesting to me, because it's like we have a literary evidence of people also dealing with this collapsed material culture and what it meant. And I don't even think we know exactly when this poem is from.
Yeah, I don't remember the manuscript history, but it's definitely some of these poets looking back at the Roman ruins around them, right?
Well, I mean, the Exeter book is from the 10th century, but like the stuff in it's like a collection of stuff before that. Like,
we are not sure with oral culture and stuff how long it's existed.
Right. And people didn't sign stuff either most of the time, so we have no idea who's writing stuff. So
exactly, there's like one or two named authors at this period, and there's no reason that they find no reason to sign any of their work. I guess you could say something like individual authorship doesn't exist the way that it does now.
It doesn't in a lot of cultures, but yeah, the ruin. These wall stones, and I'm going to try to read it. A lot of these, by the way, some of the alliteration and kinnings, which are these combination adjective, noun, metaphor stuff, that they can be somewhat preserved in modern English sometimes.
Lots still in German.
Yeah. The ruin. These wall stones are wondrous. Calamities crumpled them. These city sites crashed. The work of giants corrupted. The roofs have rusted to the earth. The towers in ruins. Ice at the joints have unroofed the barred gates. Sheared the scarred storm walls have disappeared. The years have gnawed them from beneath. A grave grip holds the master crafters, decrepit and departed, in the ground's harsh grasp, until 100 generations of human nations have trod past. Subsequently, this wall, looking gray and rust-stained, often experiencing one kingdom after another, standing still under storms, high and wide, it failed. The wine halls molder still, hewn as if by weapons, penetrated by blank, we don't know, lost. Salvaged, pulverized by blank, we don't know, lost. Blank shined, blank, 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 blank. Adroit ancient edifice bowed with crusted mud. As a side note, I'm really worried about digital corruption because it happens faster than paper corruption. But anyway, back to this. The strong purpose mind was urged to keen-minded desire and concentric struggles. The stout-hearted bound wall roots wondrously together would wire. The halls of the city once were bright. There were many bathhouses, a lofty treasury of peaked roofs, many troop roads, many mead halls filled with human joys, until a terrible chance that changed all that. I actually want to point out here there's an interesting conflation. This author is clearly describing Roman ruins.
Yep.
Um,
And
but
Bath, specifically in England, Bath, the
right,
Roman baths. Yeah.
but
He's saying mead hall. Yeah.
but does not have a frame of reference for everything that exists. So is also reading reading Anglo-Saxon material culture onto some
Yeah.
of the sites, which you
Yep.
would. I mean,
Yeah. Well, the audience probably wouldn't understand if you're trying to accurately describe like Roman, material culture. Your audience probably wouldn't understand it.
and also
Do they
you're
even
just
know who the Romans are?
yeah,
It's a
they
good question.
probably do know who the Romans are. I'll give them that.
I
But
don't know.
depends on who your audience is.
Yeah, probably.
But
The
one of the
church people would know,
yeah,
but
church
not
people would
maybe
know.
not the peasants and stuff. But
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what peasants would have known about European political history.
yeah,
like,
no, I
um,
mean he calls the poet. I mean he, it could be a she. He calls these ruins the work of giants.
yeah.
So
Days of misfortune arrived. Blows fell broadly. Death seized all the sword stout men. Their idle fanes were laid waste. The city steeds perished. Their maintaining multitudes fell to the earth. For the houses of red vaulting have drearied and shed their tiles, these roofs of winged wood. This place has sunk into ruin, been broken into heaps. There once many men, glad minded and gold bright, adorned and gleaming and proud and wine flush, shone and wore tackle. There There one could look upon treasure, upon silver, upon ornate jewelry, upon prosperity, upon possession, upon precious stones, upon the illustrious city of the broad realm. Stone houses standing here where heartstreams were cast in wide welling, and enfolded everything in bright bosom, where there were baths heated at its heart. That was convenient. When they let forth, when they pour forth blank, 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 over the hoary stones and countless heated streams, blank, 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 until ring pool hot, blank, 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 where there were baths, then is blank, 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 the kingly thing, a house, blank, 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 a city. And so one of the things that's interesting about this, on one hand, we're portraying a culture that is obviously somewhat ignorant of its past. Now, for those of us who before we get all presentist about this and start thinking these people are dumb, Shakespeare did this too. Like, one of the things about Shakespeare is like Shakespearean dramaturgy is almost always wrong because it basically projected what they did not have literary evidence for. It projected the current back into the past. And that makes sense. If you don't have a strong material notion of the past and it's not generally taught, you're just going to assume that people in the past are broadly like you.
Yeah, but also I think another possibility is that whoever is writing this understands their audience and understands that their audience is not going to understand what they're talking about, perhaps, and simply is changing, or is projecting the culture on there for the audience to understand. Potentially, they could just simply not know. So. But,
well, this is one of the things we have to ask ourselves with a text like this. We know that the composer would have probably been of relatively high social status, but we don't know that his audience was necessarily relatively high social status, and we don't know also if the composer, in this case, since it is an elegy, there's a strong likelihood that the composer is the origin of this piece, because why the hell else? Usually elegies aren't preserved like this. And it has preserved like this orally. I mean, like, yes, of course they're preserved like this otherwise, but like if we have them, they were preserved. But I mean, like, you don't. It's not like a rhyme or a nursery rhyme or a riddle where there's going to be a strong oral component that's going to be maintained and repeated. How many of us actually read any of the nursery rhymes that we all know? And how many variants are there, etc. I mean, while this may be a fading tradition, I don't know. know. Do kids still learn nursery rhymes? I actually was like thinking about
know.
this the other day. Um,
I was
but
I was literally thinking about this railroad. I've been working on the railroad the other day. It's random, but yeah.
yeah, it's funny. It's funny how much of these things are maintained and how much drops. How much of them become so idiomatic that the people saying them don't know what they're referring to anymore. And that's a conventional language that's sometimes so deep that no one knows what the original idiom was about. Like we've completely lost what the reference was. The most famous one is rule of thumb. No, it is not about beating your wife with a stick smaller than your thumb. We actually don't know where the rule of thumb comes from. Um, and a lot of times even in like late medieval or early modern manuscripts, or even actually relatively modern manuscripts, the first time something's attested to literarily is probably not the first time it is said or experienced as far as like phrases or whatnot. And we all know this because we probably know that while a lot of things in internet culture come out of weird appropriations and slang or whatever, good luck figuring out where they originally come from and how many of them have verbal predecessors and what they may have meant. I mean, and that's what Google and Urban Dictionary and stuff to help us. We can't figure this out. So in a time period like this, who the fuck knows? But it's clearly in this culture, they are in a material culture that they are experiencing this ancient past. And they weren't stupid about it. They knew that it was different from their own lives, but they also can't describe it, or if they can't describe it to everyone in a way that is going to make sense to them. And we know that, ironically, from the literary detritus we have from them. I mean, one of my favorite things, again, to tie this in about this literary stuff, but how we learn about class and all this, is reading the graffiti in the pyramids. People don't know I lived in Egypt for about 2 years, roughly, a little over 2 years, and it's crazy. Like I went to the Valley of the Kings, did the thing that you do right as a tourist, but one of the things that just fascinated me is there's 2,000-year-old graffiti on the motherfuckers. Like there's little Coptic graffitos from like the 1st century when people are hiding out from Diocletian in some of these ancient tombs, which were already 4,000 years old or something. I think some of them were more like 2,000 years old at this point. But like they were to these people what the Colosseum is to us. And not only do we have the original stuff that was there, we also have the graffiti on top of it.
Yep.
I also remember, going to the same site, actually, there was graffiti from like French soldiers in the 17th century, and it's still there. But you learn a lot from this kind of literary detritus, and poetry was where a lot of this is maintained, because in a pre-literate culture, poetry is an earworm. It's like a song. You can remember it. Like
Exactly. This is very, very important. Yeah.
Whereas like good fucking luck memorizing thousands of pages of unrhymed prose.
Oof.
Like you can memorize thousands of pages of poetry, and not even if you don't know how to read, just by repetition, you can. You're probably going to substitute things, but the meter's going to guide you, right? Just like with a song, there's only so many things that are going to fit in that spot, and that's why you remember it so well. It's because you start to forget it, and know that nighttime rhymes with lifetime in all these songs, so our right time. Those are the things. And which one of these sounds better here contextually? Okay, now I remember this lyric. Like,
the oral culture is very important, especially in this period. And oral culture may, in a way, until it's written down, it's almost untouched by the church in a sense. And probably what would have been considered pagan, although it's hard to understand how the people composing these poems would have understood them. This is where oral culture is where this kind of stuff would be, for example.
Yeah. So we've been all over the place on this, but I want to like wrap this up and then do a little thing about why I thought it was important to talk about this, because people are going like, okay, Varn, like this is all very interesting. If you're a nerd, you fucking nerd. But you and your soon to be lawyer friend need to tell us why this is important for us to understand. I'll get to that in a minute. But let's talk about Beowulf for a second. I'm fucking fascinated with Beowulf. I've been fascinated with Beowulf since I read it. I believe actually I read Grendel by John Gardner first as a 10th grader.
I've read Grendel by John Gardner as well in high school. So
right, yeah, it was like early high school, and then I got forced to read Beowulf my senior year, and everybody fucking hated it. And
well, often the teacher is not able to like really explain why it matters.
No,
I remember asking my teacher in high school, asking like, why are we reading a poem about, Denmark? This is taking place in Denmark. Why should I read this? But obviously,
yeah. What does this have to do with English?
Exactly, exactly. I remember, and the teacher was just like, oh, I don't know. I guess it's a testament to where American education is right now. But yeah,
well, it's also hard to make relevant. Like if you think about like where Americans are, like how not only is it in Denmark, but how many of us are actually like, I'm not ethnically all that related to this tradition. The only reason why I care about it is because I speak the language that descended from it. And to some ways, like, yes, I do have like some ancestry on the British Isles, mostly Wales, Scotland, and to a lesser degree Northern Ireland. But ethnically, I'm just as much North African as I am from the Isles, and yet I have this attachment to it because of the language. And I do think people, I think we're very instigated in notions of race. And I always like to remind people that most national notions, even when they're racial, religion and language play a much bigger role, even in the construction of modern race. Like, who counts as white in North America? Well, they're Protestants, motherfucker. Like, even though the person who the groups that came up with that were Portuguese, they're Catholics. They weren't considered clearly white in all parts of the United States themselves. So the irony of this needs to be understood when you understand this transition to our racialized view of human difference.
Yeah, and when we're looking back at this, it's good to almost like get our mind out of the modern period, which is highly racialized.
Yeah, these people didn't think racially. That's one thing we can say that pretty clearly. They did think in terms of ethnocentrism was all over the place. But how that actually plays out is complicated because, as we mentioned from the genetic evidence, it wasn't purely biological. Like, it wasn't even all just like, oh, we're going to kill the men and marry the women. It's not even that. Like, there's plenty of evidence that people went back and forth between these cultures, that people often have multiple identities, and even in this time period, that, yes, there wasn't that much intermarriage between social classes. Social class is super important. That's one thing that I think Marx and Engels helps you understand. Actually, this is the Marxist. People like, where's the Marxism in this? We're getting there.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing, is that Marxists have this tendency to only study like post-Renaissance, right?
Yeah, well, that's because there's a here be dragons on a whole lot of like feudalism's. I will defend the outlines of the Marxist conception of feudalism, and I have. I'm on the Chris Wickham end of things. However, it's not a singular system. It's not a coherent system. It's not even really one system. And actually, the periods of a unified social, economic, political economic world where really are quite rare in human history. We just happen to come out of one that's pretty clean, And so we tend to try to find them, but that's why, like, for Marxist, this is bracketed off. But I think one of the most important questions that I started thinking about when thinking about, well, how did capitalism come about, would be like, well, why didn't the antique world turn into capitalism with all the stuff you need for capitalism, including machinery, really, exist in the second and third century in the West, and exist actually multiple times over in the Islamicate and Chinese world, in the Indian world, and probably in the indigenous Americas too, although that's a little bit more complicated. And why doesn't it happen? Why wasn't, so I actually, I kind of take a Rosa Luxemburg view of this, and like think these, like, we have to look at these other societies more critically, and kind of, yes, we have to be dialectical and all this, but we do have to go by dialectical look at the way these things are complicated and the way they produce tensions and antagonisms that lead to all kinds of problems. And we could talk about that in medieval society meaningfully from this literature. All right. And Beowulf is where we can really get into that, actually. But it's not the same. So when I mentioned to you, for example, you're like, is there a proletariat or a working class in this time period? And the answer is not in the way we mean it now. And it is very confusing to assert it as such. Exactly. People will do it. Go ahead.
People have to be very careful, with these kinds of ideas and terms. I mean, there's definitely people who are working a lot and doing the work for, in a sense, the elites. But
but it's not a trade-based economy, really. It's land extraction. It's
rural, very rural. Like 90% of it is working the land. So
and this is actually really important. This time period of Europe is hard for us to understand because it is so rural and village-based. Whereas urban societies, which had existed, it is not like there were no urban societies before capitalism. And it wasn't just Rome either. There's been cities going, we have cities going pretty far back. It's pretty much as soon as we got agriculture, we started getting cities. And how those cities worked, we don't always understand. They weren't always as hierarchical as we tend to think of cities from the European perspective. Absolutely. But what we get from this time period is like class tensions and class collaborations and the whole conception of human social order. One, the schisming of the social, economic, and religious that we have post-Reformation, post-Enlightenment, does not exist in this time period. It is, but it's also, while individuals may live very local lives, people probably didn't go more than 20 miles from wherever they lived for most of their life. It's not also that they were cut off from the world. Trade goods were flowing everywhere. We got, as I mentioned, in 9th century Mercia or 10th century Mercia, we have coins that are clearly being minted to be traded with Arab traders on the other side of Byzantium, and they're being minted in Mercia, and we know it. We have the molds, and so these are things that I think it's hard to kind of grok both notions, not nations, at once. So Beowulf, let's get into that. I was taught Beowulf. I had a decent high school English teacher, actually, but I also had the same responses, like, oh, this is in Denmark, who the fuck cares? I'm interested in it because I'm a nerd, and my mom was a dirty hippie and into Tolkien, so of course I have to be into this stuff. But I'm also interested in it. I become interested in it because I become obsessed. If people know my background, I come from a multi-religious, multi-confessional family. And so I'm obsessed with these religious transitions, even as a child. And Beowulf, there's clearly some kind of religious transition going on being maintained in this manuscript. The culture is Christianized, but it's not, and it's unclear. Like, one of the things about it is Beowulf a Christian text that has remnants of pagan past? Is it a Christianized pagan text? frankly, we don't know.
Yeah, it's very, very tangly, very tangly. But like, for example, lots of the monsters, for example, like Grendel's mom, the dragon, these are from sagas, for example. But also at the same time, so they're from sagas, which would have been from Scandinavia, basically, essentially from texts that would not have been, or traditions that would not have been Christian.
Right.
At the same time, Beowulf is describing Grendel and Grendel's mom as the kin of Cain, right? Which is a very clearly a Christian understanding from the Bible, and it's a really great metaphor for the exile, in a sense, the kinslayer, right? And this was a huge stigmatization in Anglo-Saxon society. When you betray your lord, when you betray, a family member, for example, um, and you flee your community, this is like being in exile, and they use Cain, the Cain and Abel text from the Bible, Genesis, to demonstrate this. So yeah, you can see that the fact that the monsters are lifted straight from sagas, and that they're also described as the kin of Cain. It's very much a transition period, that's
Yeah.
embodied in the text. So
And the virtues espoused are in transition. Like, there's Christian notions of humility are not in this text. Um, and yet,
for the most part, yes.
yeah, with some exceptions, but for the most part, absolutely not. But
yeah, there's boasting, in the hall. That's an example. Yeah. Perhaps.
are there
Perhaps.
clergy in the text either? Like, this is, I can't remember. I mean, I know there's references to clergy, but are there clergy in the actual storyline? I don't think so.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I reread Beowulf for this, so yeah. No. But I think that there is an argument. There can be made an argument that, for example, when Beowulf goes off alone to fight the dragon, that this could be, and the fact that he dies, and subsequently the tribe, the Geats, are worried about being invaded by another tribe because they have lost their king. This could be, a condemnation of pride in a sense, but there's really no open, um, there's no textual, I guess, sorry, like open example of this. It's not like the narrator comes out and says, "Oh, Beowulf was prideful and he went to fight the dragon alone when he had Weelof alongside him."
yeah, I
So
mean, that's interesting there. And one of the things that we have to like, one of the things when we get into this, why is it considered a British national ethic? I mean, because it's clearly about Sweden, and
yeah,
Denmark. Um,
well, it has a lot to do with scholarship. Modern scholarship, which tries to make Beowulf into like a national epic in a sense. You
right,
know,
right. Well, this is the thing. Like, this is 19th century, early 20th century, maybe even 18th century. So early Victorian through Edwardian ideas, and this is everywhere where people are like finding these ancient things and trying to turn them into the epic origin story, just like the Greeks. Although once you actually study Greece, you realize that like, well, the Mycenaean Greeks and the modern Greeks, they're related, but like barely.
yeah.
Um,
Yep.
you know, uh, similarly with this, like, um, this is a poem that's important to peoples that live in England, and we can talk specifically about it. There's been a great debate whether or not it should be associated with the Danelaw of the Anglo-Saxons. That's not clear, even though it's written in Anglo-Saxon.
Not clear.
But there's hints everywhere in it. Like, so who are the Geats? Well, the Geats actually do have a relationship to East Anglia, which is in England, because apparently they had some ties to a royal house in the Jutes called the Wolfingas, or the Rooflingas.
Yeah.
But again, we're not totally clear on the association. Um, is this an attempt to, one of the things that we have to deal with about, depending on when we think this oral tradition lives, is this part of a Christianization attempt for Anglo-Saxons who are closely related to Scandinavians but are Christians, and Scandinavians who are not completely Christianized yet, to somehow form a joint culture that is Christian? Is this part of the attempt here? Unclear. We don't know.
Yeah,
But that's an
unclear,
interesting reading of the poem that's perfectly viable.
yeah, yeah.
We also have hints, even though this is about Denmark and Sweden, that it's tied into the English world in stuff that we've talked about, like the hints from the names that, well, some of these people are Welsh,
Yeah.
are Anglo-British.
Well, actually, yeah, Wealthal, for example, but also Wiglaf, for example, who comes out of this poem looking pretty well. There is a Wiglaf. There's a Mercian Wiglaf, and this is after Offa, who's a really important king, Mercian king. So, and that's like, I think that's like 8th century, so much earlier than the 10th century period. If you're trying to tie Beowulf to the Viking era, right? So it's really difficult to date Beowulf, and scholars are like almost, I mean, probably most of the scholarship on Beowulf could be about dating Beowulf, attempting to locate it historically,
right, and the context for figuring out the context for Beowulf, which it is. I'm just gonna say my personal opinion on it. I'm not a scholar of Beowulf in the traditional sense. Like I did basically learn on English just to fucking read Beowulf, but it's not like that's not what I wrote my major papers on in uni when I was doing literary scholarship as a undergrad or anything like that. I wrote my papers on Robert Browning, actually, and on Shakespeare. But one of the things that I'm fascinated about this text is, like, you could almost learn a lot about the modern world by doing a reception history of the theories about Beowulf, because, and this is true for we have avoided it except in the beginning. You want to get into like learning the reception history of the modern world, talk about trying to make Arthuriana coherent, like into a coherent, which is early on. I mean, one of the first secular texts printed in Caxton's printing press outside of the Bible is Mallory, right? Which is partly pretty clearly about the Roar of the Roses by using Arthur as a metaphor, but also that's really, really late. And so there's this period, particularly in the Victorian times, where there's this attempt to like turn Arthur into a national origin myth and come up with this coherent thing. And it's interesting because even at that time, it is deconstructed almost simultaneously to being constructed. Like it's like,
no, it's very similar with Beowulf. Like you have, I guess you could call it a more English nationalist perspective on it that really is anxious about dating Beowulf to around when the Vikings are around, because they want Beowulf to be produced in the context of a uniform Anglo-Saxon England. Even though, can we even talk about a uniform Anglo-Saxon England at any point? Probably not, right?
No, I was about to say, like, Alfred the Great stretching it. Like, you can maybe talk about it post Alfred, but even that's
Alfred and post Alfred, they're like trying to impose uniformity, around their West Saxon state, but even with them, it's not like they accomplish a centralized state. They're still nobles, up until the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. So
yeah, basically what unifies England is the Norman invasion. I mean, like,
the Normans were able to accomplish much more in terms of centralization than Anglo-Saxons were, in a sense.
Right. And also, like, and they're also at that point we have a much firmer grasp of what's going on because we have a literary culture that is much well, I mean, although
there's
even
more documentation, like the
right.
Domesday Book is an example of something that didn't happen. I mean, maybe it happened and we just don't have a surviving Anglo-Saxon Domes book, for example. But there's no indication that something like that was produced, in the Anglo-Saxon period.
No, there's no Domesday book. I mean, when I talked to that's an early medieval text. It's a boring as fuck one, but it's not one that we have. Like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles is kind of the closest thing we have to it.
Yeah, but it's not describing. But the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles are not describing in detail like the lay of the land.
No, absolutely not. They're not attempting to either. Like it's more just like random collection of stuff. It's not. I mean. I'm always hesitant to put, but it's like the history books in the Bible almost. Like it's a random collection of histories that are edited to be coherent by probably a priest class or some kind of kingly class, but they aren't, and it's pretty clear that they're not actually, like, even with all the redactions and stuff in it. Similarly with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, it's not a major religious text, so we don't give as much of a shit. With Beowulf, one of the interesting things about Beowulf that I find fascinating, and this is an argument for it being Christian in its origins, is we don't have a version of it in any other saga. Like, we just don't. Like, people have posited that one should exist, but we don't have it. We don't have it even referenced. Now, we don't have a lot of ancient sagas from this time period. I mean, we have there are, yes, that we have the Icelandic cycle and some other cycles, and we have the Eddas, and we have saga fragments and stuff from the runes and stuff like that. We have that, but we
don't have a narrative like Beowulf. I think that some of the monsters appear in some of these other sagas.
Yeah, but also since the Germanic peoples are related to the Scandinavians anyway. I mean, they're all part of the greater Germans. And they would not have thought of themselves as a singular people, but the Scandinavians wouldn't have thought of themselves as a singular people either. That like some of those borrowings may be because they're Scandinavian, or that maybe they were already in Anglo-Saxon tradition anyway, because they were already just there. Like, we would have to have, if we had, for example, similar manuscripts from, like, I don't know, the Goths or something, like in Old Gothic or something like that, maybe we could attest more to whether or not it was borrowed or not. But we don't have those kinds of texts from the Goths, even though we do have texts from the Gothics. I mean, like, that's the only really early German language that we actually have a lot. Well, not a lot, but we actually have.
We have a Bible, a translation, a Bible translation.
Yeah, we have a Bible translation, and we have a script, which is more than we can say for a whole lot of these other old German languages that we're like, well, we're kind of guessing what this is based off of the Romans description and the language evidence we have in the Germanic language family. It's like my favorite thing to do is when people try to tell me what, like, Proto-Indo-European religion was, and I'm like, okay, good luck figuring what the fuck you could figure out from that, because you're like, you're doing comparisons to, like, modern Hinduism and, like, Celtic myths and Roman myths, and being like, well, these words rhyme, therefore we must have this God concept. I'm like, well, the words are similar, but that's about, I don't know if you can actually do that.
No, I mean, it's really similar with, like, these people who are purporting to say what Anglo-Saxon paganism actually was.
Heathenry and all that. Reconstructionist heathenry are even more so. Celtic Reconstructionist heathenry, which we know even less.
No, everything is. I mean, there's almost like nothing outside of the church, really, in a way. Like, you can, like, the Alfred, for example, who's one of these Anglo-Saxon preachers, like, he is sometimes inveighs against these practices that the popular the populace was doing, were doing, right? And this might be something like a pagan practice. It could also just be like surviving folk practice. It doesn't necessarily have to be tied to paganism, for example. So it's really difficult to discern what paganism would have looked like. And often the church people who are describing this are often even projecting their own theological understandings onto what might be something like paganism.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big problem with like Nordic religion, where we have a lot more than we do for Anglo-Saxon, and for the only thing we have more of is like Greek. We have tons of Greek and Roman stuff. We know what that is, but like, we are doing a whole lot of rebuilding with this, and this is why studying this is important. And this is when we want to broaden out and talk about these early cultures. If we're going to talk about like all the history world of class struggle, well, we need to know what the class struggles were, and the only way to reconstruct some of this is through these texts. And one of the things that we do know, for example, we get to this, that we're talking about this through Beowulf, but we know, for example, we're dealing with a warrior culture. We're dealing with pastoral and agrarian raiders. We're dealing with fairly settled rural peoples with the centralization is the meat hall. Like, that's what we got. That
very little centralization.
Right.
But actually, there is evidence that like for example, Charlemagne and some of these kings would be using the church as almost like a proto bureau, administration in a way. But this is very, very low. It's not developed barely at all, right? So,
well, yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, one of the things that we know, for example, when people talk about the history of money, they tend to talk about states, and there's good reasons for that. Blah blah blah, chartalism, blah blah blah. I'm not going to go into those arguments here, but one of the things I can tell you that we've learned from the actual history of the anthropology and history of money is, in the deep history, the states are cities. They're centralized rulers, if they exist, or they're religious organizations. And in fact, most of the reason why we had trade in metal or anything like that at all was trade between like people traveling for religious tithing and stuff. Like, that's why. So of course they're going to base so much of this off of like the central administration, which also makes you wonder, though, what's holding this together during the pre-Christian time periods, because it's not entirely clear. The other thing that we realize,
it's a lot less centralized. Like, for example, in Scandinavia, you have these things, the tings. But there wasn't this centralized Christian king who had these churchmen who would, construct programs around him, So it's a bit more decentralized in a sense.
Yeah, I think, and in this time period, centralization is also just not possible. I want people to like think about the material limits here. Travel slow. We've already talked about the problems of food preservation, and you don't have like that's still true in, say, the Renaissance. But what changes in the Renaissance is literacy and the cheapness of producing manuscripts. Like, and yes, still a large part of the population is illiterate, but like, it's no longer, I mean, most nobles weren't literate in this time period from what we can tell. Like, there was no reason for them to be either. It's not just that they were like, barbaric. It wouldn't have been that useful for them. Like,
just
it's useful
how to use the sword, man. Like,
yeah,
at the time is the most useful thing that you can have as a noble or a king.
Yeah.
So the Alfred program, a literary program, it can almost be described as an outlier.
It's an outlier that it's interesting in like a historical material sense, because it does actually indicate that there's finally enough prosperity around this for that to be possible, but not enough for it to actually take. And so I guess my challenge here, if people, I have in the back of my mind, and this is a way to kind of turn this conversation towards what people want, other than you and I nerding out on what we can learn historically from poetry fragments and manuscript histories. But and I hope the real English nerds come out for this. And Andrew, I'm gonna tell you, in a couple months we're gonna come back on and talk about this again in a more specific context. Maybe we'll do a whole episode on Beowulf. I don't know. But one of the things I tell you from the political standpoint, from constructing this, from this historical materialist, and for those of you who are not watching and listening, I'm putting it in quotation marks because that word is often abused, or phrase. Perspective is, we do have to approach the development of our society because they do come out of these societies. I mean, one of the reasons why is Beowulf still relevant to me, a person who has like almost no ties to the Geats or what the fuck ever, and like is 1,000 years past when this was written down, and probably between 12 and 1400 years between when it was actually initially began to be composed. Maybe, who knows? Why is that relevant?
Sorry, I was going to say that Anglo-Saxon, like, people still use the word, you know, to describe like American elites, for example. Like,
right. I mean, because like the remnants of the prior society and our current one are still coded by some of the stuff, and also it is appealed to, like we were talking about, like part of the fascinating thing about the history of Beowulf is the history of the reception of Beowulf and how people try to explain what it is, as much as the poem itself. I often tell people, like, reception histories, you learn a lot about like how people are trying to build a nation. What is a national identity? Why is this important? I became, even before I was a Marxist, I became fascinated with this when I realized that like English literature as a curriculum was explicitly designed in the 19th century to compete with German philology, and that both and both classicism and Greek studies were both trying to give that a pedigree that went all the way back to ancient Rome without appealing to the church. That's the new thing, right? Because that's going to be the way around this. Is when I talk about like the national and God-shaped whole in American concepts of race, even, well, it kind of goes back to some of this stuff, because people were trying to read this stuff and use it to justify later notions and then read them back into the past, which is why we thought that, like, oh, well, of course the Anglo-Saxons came in and slaughtered all those useless, dirty Welsh and Irish, you know, because they're useless and belong on the deathbed of history, and it's not true.
Yeah.
And when you read the text, it's not even clear that they thought it was true. Like, we don't have a lot of text in the first place. We mentioned Gildas earlier, and like Gildas is what we have to rely on.
You know, example of a Welsh person who is purportedly in the ruling class, you know.
Right. So there is all this interesting stuff tied in here, I think, for someone like us, but we also have to go. There's so much that I want to talk about whenever I talk about medieval stuff, because as people know, I have a lot of hobbies, and this is one of them. But why do I think people should know this? Because in a way, like if I'm talking to an African American kid in a class today, I do have to be like, you know, why are we opposing this on you, like, in some way? And that's a legitimate question, and it's a legitimate question that I think there are some answers that are fucked up. This nation building project, as we were talking about, there's also a sense in which, like, you want to understand our history and our culture of the language that you've been speaking by historical accident. Like, you're part of this too because you speak this language. And yes, there are other things that we should know, and we should, like, I've always been like, we need more stuff in the canon and blah blah blah. These are old debates amongst English majors that I've avoided for 20 years by largely not moving in those circles. But I also think there's truth to it. Like, I don't know why we don't know more about African American literature, and I've always been a big proponent of us studying it in schools and stuff like this. But I also think we need some of this to remake this past alien to understand it. And I know that sounds strange to say make it alien and to understand it, but it's because we don't understand it because we read it in the context, maybe not our own, maybe we're not reading in context of 21st century America, but we probably are reading it in the context of 19th century England, which is still wrong. right? Like, in fact, it's probably more wrong, frankly. And we need to understand what these people were like. Is there a proletariat in England in the 9th century? No, because there's not one anywhere in the sense that we mean it in Marxism, right? That does not mean there's not a property class. The term proletariat has a history before it's picked up by socialists. Like but and there's plenty actually, but they're not the same kinds of people, and they're not dealing with the same kinds of struggles, and they're not capable of the same kinds of things for good and ill. Like, and this is not to be Whiggish about it either. There's also things which we overread as different, like guilds being somehow, more foreign to what we do today than they actually are. Like, every trade association works like a guild does. And they're almost like a mixture of a craft advocacy and a consumer protection agency and blatant competition for resources. Like, it's, and in a way, when we, like, it seems completely foreign to us. In another way, like, if we thought about it in a different, in a way where there are analogous institutions, it might make them more easy to understand. But even there, we have to be careful. Like, and I don't say this because I'm not one of those people who think like there's no thread to humanity is universal. Like, we read these. I would tell people, go back and read these Exeter manuscript riddles. They're great, actually. They're awesome. They're some of my favorite pieces of literature, period. But we can relate to those people. We can, like, I relate to that onion poem a lot. However, they aren't us either, even if they're totally relatable, because, there's a certain sense in which modern human beings are kind of consistent. But there's ways in which we're not too, and we have to parse that out. And why is this politically important? Because that's going to be, people hear me make these comparisons all the time. Well, we know this because this is like this, and then this happened over here in ancient Egypt, and this happened over here. Like, because I do think, like, if we're going to understand how we can try to conceptualize ourselves now, understanding the past and how where these social structures and religious ideas and etc. are like what we have now and where they aren't, is really important to figuring out, well, what is unique to right now, what are about our culture is part of being human, and what is unique to this particular social cultural, political, political economic stratum. And if you don't understand, if you can't come to actually, I'm going to be careful how I say this, because understanding the past is maybe the wrong way, because we can't completely understand the past. It is a foreign country, right? But it's a foreign country. It's not something completely different. It's not Silicon life based on Uranus. Like, it's not that. Like, it is still conceptually us. And so approaching where we realize the past is both not us and the discontinuities and what we learn about peoples in the past and how this did and didn't work. This is really important. And this is why, anthropology is important, but this is also why classicism is important, intellectual history is important, etc. Politically, I mean, we're going to also talk about this in another episode because you study law, but understanding, like, literary history and English common law is actually really important to understanding even where capitalist property rights came from.
Exactly.
I've become more obsessed with this lately because someone pointed out to me that, like, the commodity rent fungibility in modern capitalism really is kind of like an English common law thing, and then it wasn't always true in other laws, and that's part of why stuff could happen in England. You're just like, oh, this legal stuff actually matters. It's not just about development of the base, whatever the fuck that means. And most of the people who say that don't really know. They have very pat answers. And this also means approaching history and how we got here and where this comes from, because there's so much of this still with us. You don't ever get rid of the prior world entirely. Like, even after a revolution or whatever, that's not how this works. Like, history is still with us and still part of how we are building our lives today. And even if it's not your history and like it's not your genetic history, it's not your racial history or whatever, if you're speaking that language and dealing with that culture, it's part of your history. Um, just like when I lived in Korea, I became really obsessed with Korean cultural history and the different kingdoms and all this, because in some ways I was encountering a culture that was not mine, that I did not understand. That no, like knowing what happened in Sheila and like the ninth century probably isn't going to really help me understand how certain things are going on in modern Korea, but it might help me understand where some of this stuff may begin to come from and why certain things, like I used to really, one of the things I used to always think about, and this is just from traveling the world, is like, why is capitalism so similar and yet so different in different nations and cultures and whatnot? Like it's Koreans don't administrate, so, South Koreans do not administer capitalism in the exact same way as Americans. Like that's just a fact. Um, but why? Like what's like? There are many ways in which they also do. I mean, there's things that are like universal to capitalism, things that aren't. How do we figure that out? Um, you could go like I know some of my friends over at the member school go so far as to say like capitalism is not useful for us to talk about. Like we just need to talk about historical power relations and stuff like that. I don't go that far. I'm not sure that that's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but there is a sense in which like we do have to kind of tease this apart, and in a lot of cases, understanding this literature is the way to do it. Now, did I come to this literature because I wanted to understand Anglo-Saxon society so that I could be a better Marxist? No, I came to this literature because I enjoyed reading it, and that's another thing that I should close off. People should study what they like. Um, Particularly when you're not going to work in it anyway, because you know our future is what it is. It's one of the most fascinating things. So, what do you do to go to law school? You study literature and philosophy so that you can learn to write, and then like ignore everything you learned in law school and philosophy school. I mean, probably, you know, but it's an interesting like weirdly roundabout way of training for something. Um, and yet also kind of useful because that's why a JD, even if you don't work as a lawyer, and as you know, about half the people get a JD don't. Um, that's a law degree for people who don't know. Um, that kind of having to think about language and thinking in that particular way, and the way that it comes out of like literary culture and having to deal with history and these concepts and the way all this stuff interplays is actually really important.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah, it's all kind of related,
yeah,
like when the subjects get divided in a way, you forget that we're studying one thing, the earth and humans or whatever, reality, I guess. Um,
yeah,
but
absolutely. And it's very hard to study holistically. Um,
exactly.
it to be a generalist often means being right in broad strokes, and then all of a sudden realizing there's some key little fact that you just don't fucking know or thought you knew but are wrong about. And I should do a solo show one day going through everything that I know that I've said that's been incorrect somewhere.
Exactly.
Because
No, I mean, hey, sometimes it happens. It happens.
yeah, it happens a lot, and I actually try. Like I'm one of the few people that on my solo shows I cite my sources.
Yeah.
um, but even then, it's not always helpful. So uh, and one of the things that people will come to me is like, "What book did you get this from?" And I'm like, "You can't get some of this stuff from one book. You're having to correlate all this stuff together." That's another thing, and I would tell people to take from this. You got to be able to correlate stuff to understand the stuff. No one source, no either primary or secondary, or for sure as fuck theoretical, is going to give you all you need to know to really approach anything with any level of confidence and security. Anyway, I've been talking a lot, and we've been going for 2.5 hours, so I'm going to give you the final word and shut the hell up. So, what would you like our listeners to take away from this conversation, Andrew?
Yeah, so I think I've talked about it a bit throughout this chat, but basically, I think that it's very important that Marxists and just people in general should be thinking outside of of our current economic situation. So before the pre-Renaissance, but going to the pre-Renaissance period to actually understand pre-capitalist social relations will help you appreciate, in a sense, where we are now. And it's I would say that it's not enough just to study, since the founding of since the beginning of capitalism. So, yep. But yeah, no, thanks, Varn, for having me on. So,
Yeah, and you will be probably a quarterly guest if you want to be, because we have 3 topics that we discussed, and we only could get to a really crazy and circular part of one of them. So I'd love to have a show just on Beowulf, because I fucking love Beowulf.
Beowulf
And
is
get me,
awesome.
um, uh, and all that we learn and don't learn about Beowulf, because we've only scratched the surface there, about the different interpretations, the historical attempts to use it, etc. And then I'd like to talk to you about the way poetry and common law tell us a lot more about these sides, particularly when we talk about law, because this stuff is related. Like, I'm always fascinated by, like, in ancient Greek, logos means word, like word. It also means logic, and it also kind of implies law. So like, these are conceptually highly tied together. So thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to put the links you shared with some of these poems in the show notes, and I'll talk to you again on the show in a couple months.
All right. Sounds good, Varn.
Take care.
Take care.